Our Bibles to Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6. We continue to work our way slowly through the book of Revelation. And each week I try to do some review because there are always those here who have not been with us in previous weeks. So I ask for your patience if you have been with us. And I'll try to keep it brief tonight, the introduction, as I did last week. In studying the book of Revelation, the first 3 chapters deal with things that are not future. They deal with things that are past and even present. But once we get to chapter 4, verse 1, we begin dealing with things that are future. And so for many weeks now, we've been talking about things that have not happened yet, but things that we believe are soon going to take place. As we come to chapter 6, and this evening looking specifically at verses 7 and 8, we find that the church is in heaven, and on earth the tribulation has begun. Before this period known as the tribulation begins, I believe that Jesus is going to take Christians to heaven. This event is known as the rapture of the church. It's described in several prominent New Testament passages. When we came to Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, we spent 2 weeks on that one verse, talking about the doctrine of the rapture, and I shared some of the reasons why I believe the rapture will take place before the tribulation even begins. So the church is in heaven, and sometime after that, the tribulation begins. And the tribulation, at least the way we use the word, is that 7-year period that's known by so many different names in the Bible. We gave you a whole list of those names in one of our previous studies. And really, it's the last 3.5 years that Jesus said are the Great Tribulation. But we typically refer to the whole 7-year period as the tribulation. So you understand how I'm using the term. So understanding then that the tribulation has begun at this point in the book of Revelation, we've learned about the first several things that God says in His Word will happen. Maybe you'll recall, if you were with us, that in chapters 4 and 5, when we saw the church worshiping in heaven, that the Father was seated on His throne and He was holding a scroll. And we understand that that scroll is the title deed to the earth. We were told that that scroll is sealed with 7 seals. And as Jesus came and took the scroll from the Father, He now in chapter 6 begins to open that seal, or that scroll, breaking first one seal and then another. And so as each seal is broken, we learn something about what's happening in these earliest months and perhaps years of the tribulation period. So, interestingly, the first 4 of the 7 seals are horsemen. We sometimes refer to them as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. We saw in verses 1 and 2 the white horse. And we talked about the fact that the white horse represents the Antichrist, the false Messiah. And then in verses 3 and 4, we saw the red horse, which represents war. And we learned that shortly after the tribulation begins, with a time of peace, that war will once again break out on the earth. And then in verses 5 and 6, we read about the black horse. We learned last week that the black horse represents famine and even inflation. The inflation probably being the root cause of the famine. Now tonight, as we come to verses 7 and 8, we are going to encounter a pale horse. And so let's read verses 7 and 8. It says, "When He opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth." Now, I've said already that there are 7 seals. So the horses that we've named correspond. The white horse was the first seal, the red horse the second, the black horse the third. And now the pale horse is the fourth seal. And so verse 7, after talking about the opening of the fourth seal, talks about the voice of the fourth living creature. Now, there are 4 living creatures that are said to be in the midst of and around the throne of God. We were introduced to them in chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. We learned then that they are cherubim. And interestingly, we saw in their description that each one of them had a different appearance. The first living creature had that of a lion. The second living creature, that of a calf. The third living creature, that of a man. And so this fourth living creature that's associated with this fourth seal and with this pale horse had the likeness of an eagle. And this is what the cherubim said. Come and see, which may be understood, like verses 1, 3, and 5, as an invitation to John to see what is going to happen as this rider comes forth on the pale horse. Or it could also be understood as a command to the rider of the pale horse to go forth, to do that which he's been authorized to do. In fact, that language, or nearly that language, is used in the 8th verse. And so we come then to the 8th verse, and I'll read it again. I looked, and behold, a pale horse. The name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. Power, or authority, was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. Now, it's interesting that the verse begins with the words, and I looked and behold, because that's the exact formula that we found in verse 2 regarding the first horseman. It is not repeated regarding the second horseman or the third horseman. In regard to the second horseman, he simply says, another horse. In regard to the third horseman, he refers to hearing a voice. But only here does he use this formula, I looked and behold, which seems to suggest that this particular horse was as staggering in its impact upon John as the first one was. That's not to say that the second and third horses did not greatly impact John, but there was something unique about the fourth horse, like there was about the first. It tells us that it was a pale horse. That's fairly descriptive, though it doesn't really give us a color, does it? In fact, this Greek word, which we'll talk more about later, is used 4 times in the New Testament. The other 3 times it's used, once in Mark, twice in Revelation, it is translated green. And it is always used in reference to grass, green grass. So perhaps we might understand this as a pale green. And some have even suggested, as we think of a pale yellowish green color, the color of a corpse, since this obviously is related to death. You find the word death twice in the 8th verse. Green is normally a color that we would associate with life and not with death. And so, to the extent that we see it as being a green, Henry Morris referred to it as a prophetic irony. Now, it tells us that the name of him who sat on this pale horse was Death. So you might think of it as the Grim Reaper, you know. The Grim Reaper is sitting on this horse. So I remember seeing a TV commercial some months ago where the Grim Reaper shows up to take a guy's life and ends up eating popcorn on the couch instead. I don't think that's going to happen with this fella. I don't think this guy named Death is going to be interested in anything produced by Orville Redenbacher. He's got a job to do, and he's going to do it. It says that Hades followed with him, and this is a rather interesting reference. I'd like you to hold your finger here and turn back to the book of Luke, chapter 16. If you're familiar with this passage, you might wish that we weren't turning to it and weren't going to read through it. But if you're not familiar with it, this will be very enlightening, I think, for you. It will help you understand not only the passage we're studying tonight, but it will help you understand other things as well. In Luke chapter 16, beginning with the 19th verse, Jesus tells a story. And I chose that word story carefully because many people refer to it as a parable. I recently was talking with someone about this passage and accidentally called it a parable. I was quick to correct myself. I don't believe it as a parable. I believe it as a story that Jesus is in fact relating a factual event. In Jesus' parables, he never named characters. In this particular story, he does name one of the characters. And so it says, beginning in verse 19, there was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. But there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So it was that the beggar died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. Then he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and you are tormented. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, so that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us. Then he said, I beg you therefore, Father, that you would send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. Abraham said to him, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. There's so many interesting points in this passage, it's hard for me to resist the temptation to do exposition on this passage rather than the one we're studying. And I need to be disciplined enough to limit my comments to what relates to our study tonight. So, I'll try to control myself. We learn from this story some things that we might not otherwise understand about what we typically call hell. And that is that hell is not one compartment, but 2 or 3. I'll explain what I mean by that. 2 compartments, in that there is one known by the Greek word Gehenna. That's the lake of fire, the great gulf that was referred to in the story we just read. And then another, referred to in the Greek as Hades, which is actually made up of 2 compartments. Well, I say 2 or 3, depending on how you look at it. One compartment of Hades on one side of the lake of fire, the other compartment of Hades on the other side of the lake of fire. Before the cross, when an individual died, if that individual was saved, and we know that people were saved the same way in the Old Testament that they are in the New, by faith. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him for righteousness, the Scriptures say. They were looking forward to the cross. We look back to the cross, both looking in faith, believing. Those who were not saved went to this compartment of Hades that we refer to as torments, because it's described as such in this passage that we just read in Luke 16. Those who were saved went to the other compartment of Hades, which we sometimes refer to as Abraham's bosom, because that's the way it's described in this passage. We also sometimes refer to it as paradise. Jesus referred to it that way. When hanging upon the cross, he said to the repentant thief, Today you will be with me in paradise. So in Ephesians chapter 4, it tells us that when Jesus died, he preached to those who were in captivity, and then that he took captivity itself captive. We believe that those who were in Abraham's bosom or in paradise upon Christ's resurrection were then able to go to heaven. And we believe that some of those were actually resurrected, because the book of Matthew tells us that a very small number of them were seen in Jerusalem for some days. That, again, is a whole other topic. I better be careful, or I'm going to go off on that rabbit trail. So today, when a Christian dies, a Christian does not go to Abraham's bosom or paradise. A Christian goes to heaven to be with the Lord. Paul said very clearly that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And so we believe that. We don't believe in soul sleep, 2 eyeballs floating around out there somewhere, or any other weird ideas. We believe that we go to be with the Lord. So you understand then that when we get to the New Testament, and if you haven't already, you can turn back to Revelation. When we get to the New Testament, book of Revelation, and it's talking about Hades, it's referring very specifically to that compartment of Hades that we know as torments, where the wicked dead are. They are there in that place. It may be, as some commentators have suggested, that because Hades, referring only to the abode of the wicked dead at this stage in history, might indicate that the things that we are told happen here only affect unbelievers. Only Hades is said as following along behind this horseman. You understand that though the church is in heaven, and we're going to learn more about this next week, that there will be those who are being saved here on earth during the tribulation. So it would appear that they would not be affected by what we're reading in these verses. Now it says that power was given to them. And I told you already that the word power can also be translated authority. That's interesting in light of the fact that we're talking about death and Hades. Back in chapter 1, verse 18, we were told that Jesus held the keys to death and to Hades. And later on in our study, when we get to chapter 20 and verses 13 and 14, we learn that after the great white throne judgment, that death and Hades will be cast into the lake of fire. Who's in the lake of fire now? No one. We think Satan's hanging out in the lake of fire. You know, he's wearing an asbestos t-shirt and wanting to turn it up because he likes the heat. No way. That's going to be a place of eternal torture for Satan as well. The first individuals that we see thrown into the lake of fire are the Antichrist and the false prophet. We'll get that in our study of Revelation. One of the reasons we know that people are not annihilated in hell, but that they suffer there forever, is that 1,000 years later, the Antichrist and the false prophet are still conscious in hell. So that's a sobering subject, which we also will get much more on later. But Jesus obviously has the right to give this power or this authority, and He does, and it is to kill. It's an interesting verb because it's in the active voice. It's not passive. It's not, that they are to allow people to die, but it's active, meaning that they are to take these lives. That'll play into something that we'll share a little bit later on. And it also tells us that power was given to them over 1/4 of the earth. Now, as we begin to talk in a while about pestilence, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but we're going to be talking soon about pestilence, and it's important to understand that when it tells us that power was given them over 1/4 of the earth, we're not talking about an epidemic, we are talking about a pandemic. Not something that's geographically isolated, but something that is global in its impact. Now also, this gives us an idea how many people are going to die. As the population is around the 6 billion mark, 1.5 billion people are going to die. That's heavy. 1 person in 4. 1.5 billion people. As a result of this one seal, or perhaps because this seal seems to review the 2 that precede it, as a result of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th seals. This would be almost unprecedented. You would have to go all the way back to the times of Noah to find something that was this catastrophic or more catastrophic. And so it's going to be incredible in the worst sense of the word when it happens. Now, how long does this time period last? I mean, in other words, how long are these 1.5 billion deaths spread out? Well, these events are taking place in the first half of the tribulation. I believe that chapters 6 through 11 describe things that happen in the first 3.5 years. So we're not talking about that long a period of time. We may be talking about years, a year or 2. We may even be talking about months, which makes it that much more staggering to understand what we're reading. Well, then in verse 8 it continues talking about how death and Hades are going to take these lives. With sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. So when it says with sword, it may very well be looking back to the second horseman, to the second seal. This was the red horse of war. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago and mentioned it briefly in our introduction tonight. As we look around the world, even watching the news since that particular message in this series, we see more and more things happening in the world around us. The possibilities of armed conflicts erupting, others that continue. And then it talks about them taking these lives with hunger. And that seems to relate back to the third seal, or the third horseman. This was the black horse that dealt with famine and with inflation. I thought it was interesting looking at the news just today in this particular regard. The Associated Press announcing today that Amartya Sen, a scholar from India, was awarded a Nobel Prize in economics today, specifically for his work regarding famine and hunger. And his best-known work is a 1981 book entitled Poverty and Famines, an essay on entitlement and deprivation. What's interesting about that book is that it challenges the common view that the shortage of food is the most important explanation of famine. Remember last week we talked about the fact that the black horseman probably had less to do with a shortage of food than it did with inflation, brought on as part of the economic woes that we are seeing developing and that will be much worse during the tribulation, perhaps even deliberately brought about. And we referred to examples from recent history to establish that possibility. Also today, the Associated Press reported that the relatively new Prime Minister of Russia said that the most difficult and complex period in the history of his country was just ahead. And he announced that the government was creating a $600 million emergency food reserve. This reserve would last for 2 weeks and cover the needs of a third of Russia's population. Now, of course, he was quick to add that no serious food shortages are expecting. They want to be prepared just in case there are hardships this winter. That sounds like something a prime minister in Russia would say, even as people can't get their money out of banks and can't seem to find groceries on the grocery store shelves. And so every day as you watch the news, you see the things that we're talking about on Wednesday evenings happening and developing in a way that's real consistent with what the Scriptures say. Well, after then it talks about war, a throwback to the red horse, and after it talks about hunger, a throwback to the black horse, it then begins to talk about death. And the Greek word that's translated death is actually a very general word. It doesn't refer only to pestilence, but it does not exclude pestilence. The reason why we would think of it as primarily relating to pestilence, and the translation of the Bible that you hold in your lap may very well say pestilence, and I don't think that's necessarily a poor translation, because parallel passages are very, very clear as to what kind of death we're talking about. Hold your finger here again and turn back quickly to the book of Matthew, chapter 24. Matthew 24. I'm going to turn to another verse that I'll just relate to you immediately after that. In Matthew chapter 24, we've referred to it the last couple of weeks. It's talking about the signs of Christ's return. And beginning in verse 6, he said, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." Our passage tonight talks about death and Hades, killing with war. "And there will be famines." Our text tonight talks about death and Hades, killing with hunger, and pestilences. So you see how this is a parallel passage. And here we have not the general word, but the specific word, pestilences. You might make a note of this. In Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 21, there's an interesting verse, different in some ways, similar in others. "For thus says the Lord God, how much more it shall be when I send my 4 severe judgments on Jerusalem, the sword, and famine and wild beasts, which are named after death in our text tonight, and pestilence, to cut off man and beast from it. Well, let's turn back then to the book of Revelation. I believe that the pale horse, the fourth seal, does refer to pestilence. Well, as we begin to think and talk some then about pestilence, perhaps the first thing that comes to our mind is disease, it's viruses, it's bacterial infections, things of these natures. We think, for one, of the Ebola virus. And I'm reading from the Encarta 98 Desk Encyclopedia as it describes the symptoms. Ebola produces severe headache, weakness, and muscle aches, followed by vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, inflammation of the throat and of the mucous membranes in the eye, bleeding from body openings, and often destruction of internal tissues. The disease often progresses swiftly, usually 7 to 10 days, to extreme exhaustion, dehydration, and death. The mortality rates have been between 60 and 88%. There are no proven drugs to treat Ebola, and currently there is little hope of developing a vaccine against the virus. Now, a little bit regarding its history. The Ebola virus was first identified in 1976 when 2 epidemics occurred, one in Zaire, the other in Sudan. The combined outbreaks resulted in 550 cases and 430 deaths. Another large epidemic occurred in Zaire during the summer of 1995. Maybe you remember this one. Infecting 315 people and killing 242. Ebola and its relative Marburg, which also causes the same symptoms, are the only disease-causing human viruses for which the host and the natural transmission cycle remain unknown. Infection between human beings is principally by direct close contact. Handling the Ebola virus requires the greatest safety precautions. Scientists who study the virus work in special protective clothing, and their laboratories contain equipment that sterilizes air, liquid wastes, and solid wastes. And that is bad stuff. Ebola. But that's hardly where the list ends of things that we have seen that could potentially break out during the tribulation period. We also would think naturally of staph infections. According to Chuck Missler's research, staph bacteria are the #1 cause of hospital infections. They're blamed for 13% of the nation's 2 million hospital infections each year, which kill 60 to 80,000 people each year. He writes that the increasing resistance is attributed to the overuse of antibiotics and the failure of some patients to take their medicine properly. Some patients stop taking their medicine once they feel better, but before the infection has been knocked out, enabling the hardiest germs to survive and multiply. A friend of mine who is a Calvary Chapel pastor was staying in a friend's house in Mexico. They're on the coast in Baja. He was hanging out and just resting and relaxing and recovering from surgery, actually, and grew violently ill. I mean, he was really, really sick. Had to be flown back by helicopter and nearly died because staph infection had developed, within his body from the surgery that he had had. So it is a very serious thing and a very scary thing. Well, we might also think about strep infections. Strep throat is a nuisance, but hardly anything compared to the severe invasive group A streptococcus, which has also been referred to as the deadly flesh-eating bacteria. Within 24 hours of exposure, the patient develops flu-like symptoms, including fever and chills. Over the next day or two, conditions worsen. A rash may develop. And after this, the illness can eat away flesh and muscle at a rate of up to 1 inch per hour. That's pretty scary. And it was interesting that during the most recent outbreak, Central Texas was one of the places that was being highlighted in the national media because of the number of cases that were reported right here. And you remember, you saw it on the news yourself. Well, also, there's much concern about tuberculosis, and we are going to talk more about that in just a few minutes. But tuberculosis is making a comeback. And there was a recent report, several years ago, by, I think it was Time Magazine, that claimed that 40% of those with TB had new cases. Doctors were shocked to learn that because they were estimating that perhaps only 10% of those who had TB were new cases, but 40% were. So as I said, we'll revisit that. It may well be that when we begin to talk about disease, the thing that we all think about more than anything else is AIDS. Certainly we've heard more about that than anything else over the last decade plus. A Dr. Cianci, who is, I understand it, was a public health official in Philadelphia for some years, speaking just this last July at the annual International Prophecy Conference, gave a message entitled, AIDS, the Perfect End-Time Plague, by which he meant that in so many ways it could fulfill the prophecies regarding pestilence. He spoke for over an hour, but he began his message by giving 12 reasons why he believed that AIDS was the perfect end-time plague. And I'll just relate the basic reasons to you with only a couple of comments. Some of them are simply observations on his part. Number one, he pointed out that the AIDS virus is sexually transmitted, very consistent with the immorality of our age. Number two, that it also is transmitted through the use of needles, consistent with the drug culture of our age. Number three, he pointed out that unlike other diseases, with AIDS you have a choice not to put yourself at high risk, not to be in a high-risk category. Number four, he pointed out that you can actually carry this for 8 to 10 years before becoming symptomatic. Many of these things you've heard before. Number five, he states that they cannot develop a vaccine to prevent it or a drug to cure it. Number six, he says that because it is continually mutating, it's only a matter of time before all of the drugs that are developed to slow its replication will become obsolete. It's impossible to keep up with it. Number seven, he says that nearly all opportunistic infections found in people with AIDS have pain and some dermatological manifestation, by which he's referring to lesions and such on the skin. And we find references to just that sort of thing later in the book of Revelation. Number eight, he points out that unlike former plagues, AIDS is pandemic. We talked about the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. Number nine, that AIDS itself doesn't kill anyone, that it destroys the immune system. And it allows other things that might not ordinarily kill someone to claim that life, because their immune system has been destroyed. So suddenly, for those who have this, there are many, many more threats to their life, things that you or I wouldn't even be worried about. Number 10, it is possible, he states, that diseases that are now found only in animals may someday be transmitted to people with AIDS. He goes on to talk about some of the ways that that might happen. Number 11, that AIDS-related diseases will mutate into more virulent and ferocious forms, so that even people without AIDS will become infected. And then number 12, he points out that it's man-made, by which he refers to the fact that this has not been handled the way other epidemics, much less a pandemic, have been handled in the past. And so it has in many ways been facilitated and worsened by inaction as compared to the way other things have been handled. Well, all of these things are very interesting as he talks about the fact that not only could AIDS itself very much play into what we read about the pale horse, but that it opens the door to so many other things. We talked about how that which might not otherwise kill a person can kill them if they don't have their immune system. Their immune system isn't functioning properly. He goes on to give specific examples of that, talking about diseases that were either rare before the outbreak of AIDS or even unheard of before the outbreak of AIDS, that are now rapidly increasing. And he talks about the fact that when you have an individual with AIDS, you have a bug in a weakened system that becomes an incubator in which these bugs do, in fact, develop into stronger strains. And as those strains can be and are being spread, you have the spread of many other diseases in more radical forms than you had them before. Well, this all comes from this particular doctor, from his observations and study. Certainly there are many different opinions about things of this nature. In reviewing some recent press clippings from the last week, I came across some things that I thought you might find interesting. Some of them that you've heard yourself if you've been watching the news or reading the newspaper. No one really knows exactly how many cases of AIDS there are in the world or even in the United States. It's estimated that there are close to 1 million or more cases in the United States, but others would say that that was a very conservative estimate. The big news over the last week or so is in regard to the actual decline in AIDS-related deaths, decline in the mortality rate. Last Thursday, in the New York Times, Stephen Holmes reported that the AIDS mortality rate in the United States decreased by 46.4% in 1997, according to new data from the National Center for Health Statistics. This actually means that the death rate fell to the lowest level since 1987, the first year that AIDS deaths were tracked. And so AIDS, having ranked as the 8th leading cause of death in the United States in 1996, fell to the 14th leading cause in 1997. Now, if that's all you heard on the news, and chances are it was, that sounds pretty encouraging. However, the problem is that while the number of deaths declined, the number of new cases did not. There are just as many people getting it as before. They're reporting in the United States about 40,000 new cases a year, the same number as the year before. So, in fact, what's happening, and I don't believe there's anybody here tonight that, well, I hope not, that isn't glad for those who get relief from their suffering, that isn't glad for those who perhaps have years added to their life. I would certainly hope that our hearts are tender enough that we would think that was a good thing, a positive thing. But looking at the health risk for a moment, it's interesting to realize, and this is not simply my observation, it's the observation that was made in the New York Times, as well as by Dr. Cianci, that when you have less people dying as a result of these new drugs, but just as many new cases each year, you have an increasing population of infected people who put everyone else at risk. It means that as this trend continues, there is a greater risk to others of getting AIDS. And it may be that because of the medication, they're going to live longer once they get full-blown AIDS, but it increases the likelihood that they may get it. So something interesting to consider. Other things that have been in the news, the Associated Press reported today that an estimated 8,000 HIV-infected women become pregnant each year. And when you look at that in terms of the world, a week ago, last Wednesday, Reuters quoted Dr. Peter Pyatt, the executive director of the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS, who had said the day before, a week ago, yesterday, that over 500,000 children were infected worldwide through mother-to-child transmission in 1997, with over 1.5 million orphaned due to the disease. That's unbelievable. 1.5 million children orphaned last year because of AIDS. And when you begin to realize that all of this pales in comparison to what we're reading about, this pale horse, death, Hades, a power given to them over a fourth of the earth, 1.5 billion people. It's truly a wipeout to even begin to consider or to imagine what that is going to be like for those who are here during that time. Well, let's move on for a moment. Because it's not just disease that could be spoken of here. We're going to hit several other things in the time we have left together. See, now I'm on my borrowed time. Isn't this cool? Told you I'd use it. There is the possibility that this could refer, at least in part, to biological warfare. Despite the fact that the world is ostensibly opposed to it, many nations in the world continue to develop such weapons. In 1989, CIA Director William Webster reported at least 10 countries that had been named as biological weapon suspects. This included Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, North Korea, Taiwan, Israel, Egypt, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, Bulgaria, India, South Korea, South Africa, China, and Russia. Iraq has acknowledged that during the 1991 Persian Gulf War it possessed Scud missiles tipped with biological warheads. And of course, there's all the recent controversy regarding these inspections that are supposed to be going on that don't, in fact, seem to be going on. And the one member of the United Nations team that recently resigned, in an interview in one of the major news magazines, I don't remember now if it was Time or Newsweek, I'm thinking maybe it was Newsweek, he referred to a joke that's going around in his circle that Madeleine Albright has actually stopped more inspections than Saddam Hussein has. And that's kind of interesting coming from someone who would have a little bit more insight than you or I would as to what's going on. But it is entirely possible that during the tribulation you could see such biological warfare. Remember that the red horse represents war. Talked about the possibility several weeks ago of a limited nuclear exchange, perhaps just preceding the beginning of the tribulation. There is also the very real possibility that there could be biological warfare that would take place early on. And something that's interesting in this regard, is it a tip? Is it a clue? The Greek word pale that we referred to before as appearing 4 times in the New Testament, 3 times translated green, 1 time translated pale, is actually the Greek word chloros. So some have referred to the chlorine gas that was used as a weapon in World War I. Whether or not that might indicate that biological warfare is at least part of what is being pictured here. We may feel, rightly or wrongly, safe in terms of biological warfare. You may not lay awake tonight worrying that a Scud missile from Iraq is going to somehow travel much further than it is capable of traveling and, bringing this biological weapon into your front yard. What would be a greater concern, perhaps, to you and I would be biological terrorism. Particularly at a time when we see terrorist attacks directed toward United States citizens and in recent years, actually, in the United States on the increase. And there are people in many different parts of the world who are very much committed to carrying out such acts of terrorism. And some of them who have the capabilities to use a biological weapon in their terrorist attacks. You may remember that it was just a few years ago, in 1995, when the nerve gas sarin was unleashed in the Tokyo subway station, killing 12 people and injuring 5,500. This was an odd cult group that was involved in that. But it is just as possible that other groups, even here in the United States, could try to do something like that. And even that's been in the news in the last several months. One man who was arrested because he was suspected of developing such weapons. However, it is said that many, many more people would have died in that sarin gas attack had it not been that it was not mixed correctly. That actually, if it had been mixed correctly, it would have been a much, much greater loss of life. And so it's something to think about, the possibility that this could happen. This particular gas, just a tiny drop of it, can kill within minutes after skin contact or inhalation. And so I think that it is not so unrealistic to suggest that these types of attacks, terrorist attacks with biological weapons, could take place right here in the United States. But it's also possible that that's part of what is pictured by this pale horse. Acts of terrorism that include these agents. Well, something else that's interesting, and this will pretty much round out our text, but raise a few more issues before we close. If you look at the end of the verse, there's one thing we haven't talked about yet. After death, it says, and by the beasts of the earth. It would seem to be unique to this seal, and therefore something that would go hand in hand with this death or with this pestilence. And there have actually been a number of things suggested as to what this could refer to. For example, some have suggested that these beasts of the earth could be rats. There are more than 100 species of rats. They're responsible for the loss of $1 billion of food annually in the United States alone. Their fleas carry bubonic plague, which claimed 1/3 of the population of Europe in the 14th century. So some have suggested perhaps these are rats. Others have suggested that they could be poisonous snakes. The book of Acts, chapter 28, verses 4 and 5. This very same Greek word is used in each verse for poisonous snakes. So possible that there would be this proliferation of snakes. Now, you guys love snakes, don't you? Wouldn't that be a nightmare? Poisonous snakes all over the place. Well, it could also just refer to wild animals. This, by definition, would be what we would understand the word to mean. It's most often translated animals. Sometimes wild animals, and on one occasion, a poisonous animal. So perhaps it refers to wild animals. And certainly there have been cases where, as the food supply is affected, animals not finding food become more inclined or predisposed, if you will, to attacking people. Animals that aren't even necessarily normally associated with attacking humans. When there's a problem with the food supply, will sometimes begin to do that. So that's a possibility. But remember also, when I was quoting the 12 points made by Dr. Cianci about the AIDS situation, he talked about the possibility that AIDS patients, as their immune system is affected, could possibly begin to get diseases that up until now only animals have had. And if that were to happen, and if that then began to spread from one person to another, and he does a good job of explaining how this could take place, could it be that that is what is meant? Death or pestilence, accompanied by these beasts of the earth. AIDS, and as a result of AIDS, the introduction of diseases that up until now had only been known in beasts, in animals, but now being introduced to the human race. Possibility. One other possibility we need to talk about. In the book of Revelation, you'll find the word beast or beasts 38 times. With this one exception, it refers to an evil leader. We'll talk much more about that in the weeks to come. No reason to explore that now. Is it possible then that the reference here is to evil leaders? And the possibility that this pestilence is man-made and that it is very deliberately perpetrated against human beings. Certainly that is a possibility. It might be considered population control, which is a big issue around the world today. It could be considered ethnic cleansing, which tragically we see claiming the lives of people in many parts of the world today. But the bottom line is that we could be talking about genocide. The very willful, deliberate extermination of 1/4 of the human race. That's pretty radical to think about. Perhaps the most sinister thing that we've suggested tonight. And before you're too quick to write it off, I would remind you that the atrocities that were committed in Nazi Germany are only 50 years behind us. Half a century behind us. It's amazing to realize what a short time has passed since millions of people were killed. And so it's very possible that this pale horse could refer to, if not include, at least, genocide. So, once again, we find ourselves coming to the end of a study in Revelation, thinking, boy, this was uplifting. You know, there's just no way around it. This is heavy stuff. Now, before anyone suggests, gee, why do we even need to study this? Well, I think the fact that God put it in the Bible is all the reason we need it. But when we began the series, I talked about the profound effect that prophecy can have in our lives, cleansing us, compelling us, and comforting us. And we talked about passages of Scripture that use prophecy in those lights. I think that each week as we study together, we should certainly be thankful to God that His plan for us is so wonderful. And that it's not His intention to leave us here during this time, but it is His intention to take us home to heaven, where we'll be with Him. But I think also, as we've tried to remind you, it is a time to think very, very seriously about your loved ones who you haven't told about Christ, about your friends who you haven't ever asked if they'd like to pray to receive the Lord. They know you're Christians, but have you ever really had a heart-to-heart talk with them? Have you ever said to them that you believe Jesus is coming back very, very soon? And that more than anything, you don't want them to be here when the tribulation begins. That you want them to go with you to your heavenly home. I think that there ought to be a real sense of urgency. If we really believe anything at all that we're studying in Revelation, there ought to be a genuine sense of urgency about sharing our faith and about closing the deal. Not just being content to drop a couple seeds, but at least giving them the opportunity to pray to receive Christ. And if they say no, then all you can do is take comfort in the fact that you planted seeds and pray that God waters them and that someone else has the privilege of reaping what you've sown. But I think we need to get a little bit more bold in our witness. Get away from, bumper sticker witnessing, which is about all some of us do in personal conversation. Throw out a couple of Christian cliches and feel as if we've done our duty. And begin to genuinely and passionately from our hearts tell people about Christ, how desperately they need Him, and how easily they can receive the free gift of eternal life if they'll acknowledge and turn from their sin and receive Christ as their Savior. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, we do pray that you, by your Holy Spirit,